So let's begin our refactor. So if you remember, this is the Stacks application that we've used for a couple of demos, and it's also sort of become this Pokemon list application where we show a list of Pokemon. And so you can see the preview on the right. I'm just looking at Pokemon list view. Uh, and so if we look at our files here on the left, right, Stacks and Geo are not part of our application, so we'll ignore those because those are other examples. But you could think of these maybe as helper views or something like that in a larger project. But for our intents and purposes, right, we just have Pokemon list, row, and then content view. And you can see our content view calls Pokemon list. So this is where the thing gets started. And of course, so of course, Stacks app, which is the name of the app. This is where it starts. We have a main, right? This is that app thing. Then the scene. Inside that the window group, and then our very first view, which is content view. Now you can change this, right? This is just the default, but I find it kind of handy to keep content view, and we always kind of reminds ourselves that this is the root view. It's possible in a complicated app, you might have more than one in this window group, but since we just have one window, we just have one content view. And so inside the content view, which is just a view like any other, it's generated for us, then we start loading our custom stuff. So in this case, we load this Pokemon list, and you can see that on the right. So let's take a look at our Pokemon list, and let's begin refactoring. Now the first thing you want to do when you are refactoring code is you want to turn off the preview because it's just going to have errors and go crazy and use system resources because it's trying to build all the time, even when you're in the middle of like doing surgery on your app, right, in the middle of changing all these things. So you really don't want it to do that because it just gives you errors you don't need to see and slows things down. So we know that this is working, but when we refactor, we want to come up and we want to turn this off. So we can say show editor only. Okay, so now we have more space, nice clean space, and we can get to the refactoring. So the first thing that you'll notice is, we actually have a model already. It's just we have not separated it outside. So this var feed, this array of posts, this is our model, right? This is the data, in this case sort of dummy data, that our whole app is using. And the other thing that's part of our model is down here where we define post, right? We need to create a struct of post, say that it's identifiable, and then we create the array of posts, and then those get used in our list. So it's important to remember whether or not you use a design pattern like MVVM or not, you have a model no matter what, right? It's impossible to create an application without some kind of model because that model is the data that your UI is displaying. The difference, what we're doing now is we are separating concerns, right? Right now, this is not a good solution because our model struct, this feed, is written inside our SwiftUI inside our view. So there is no separation of concerns. And you can imagine as soon as this app goes anything beyond something trivial, something like this demonstration app, it will be very messy and very hard to reason about and that sort of thing. So our goal here is to separate what already exists in our little simple app so that it can scale, so that it's more organized, and we can use it in more complicated situations. So the first thing we need to do is create a new Swift file to hold the model. And what's important for the model, if you remember, it should be a struct, but it should not be a SwiftUI view. So when we go to new file, and when we have this window, for the model, we don't want a SwiftUI view. We just want a Swift file. And in case you're wondering, there's all these other things. The only two that we're going to use, right, it's either a Swift file or a SwiftUI view. And honestly, you can change it. It's just what you can change what is given to you. This is just what's pre-populated. And in Swift UI, these are the only things you need. This other stuff, Cocoa Touch class, these other things are for either UI kit or app kit or other things like storyboard, right? This is all the things I talked about in lecture of kind of the legacy UI kit, app kit way to do interfaces. But you can see it's still organized for us. So these are all interface ways to do interfaces. And this is ways to do our logic, which your logic fits kind of inside the model. And yeah, there are a bunch of other things, but we won't get into that right now. So, okay, we want a Swift file. Go ahead and click next. And we're going to call this, since we're managing posts, that's kind of what the model does. We're going to say it's a Pokemon posts manager. And it's usually a good idea, either your model or your view model, giving it a manager name. Not always, but it's sometimes usually helpful to describe what it does. So go ahead and create that. And you can see we just have Foundation. We don't have Swift UI, and that's fine. That's all we want for now. So if we go back up to our list, we know that we want this thing out of here. So remove that. Oh wait, but we don't have an object yet, right? It's just import Foundation. There's nothing here. So we do want a struct, and we do want to call this Pokemon posts manager. And this is our own struct. It doesn't necessarily need to comply or adhere to any protocol, so that's fine. And now inside of this struct, we will place our variable. All right, so we got that. And let's also take this. This is our struct showing our post. And in a more complicated app, I would create my own file actually for this, and I would name it post, right? And so this would be all in its own file. Since this is so simple, I think it's okay to put these together. Another thing, and this is a preference, sometimes it's good to have the struct outside like this, like for posts, because you might use the post in different managers, different models, right? Both of these are part of the model, but this is just defining the thing. This is sort of using the thing and applying logic to it. And sometimes you want this out in the root view. What you could do is you can actually nest this inside, right? And so this post becomes part of this thing, which means in order to use it, if I have struct my dummy, if I want to create, I cannot just say post, right? It's, well, okay, because I'm on the same file. Bad example. It's because I'm on the same Swift file, but normally you can't. So what you'd have to do, you have to say something like this. You have to say Pokemon posts manager dot post. See, like that. And then you would instantiate it or, do something with it. So it sort of depends if you want to nest this inside or not. And it's personal preference. For me, I don't like to do that. I rarely find it helpful, and it usually is constricting. But I'm sure there's always an exception, and it does depend what you want to do. So I'll have it separate. And again, this might have its own file and a more complicated thing. But in our situation, it's fine to leave them together. All right. So now this is great. Our list is just that. It is just an image list. It's just a view. And now our model is all together over here. So what we might do to kind of help, organize this is if we right click, we want a new group from selection. And so the group we will call model. Notice that I do not have model in the name of the actual struct. And that's because in many apps you'll have more than one model, and it gets redundant to call everything model. And so you want to use the name to say more of what it does. And in this case, it manages posts, right? We have this feed that's posts. And in fact, I'm not sure I totally like that name. Let's rename this posts, just to be consistent. In any case, this is telling us what it does. So we don't need model in the name. But to organize all of our models together, I think it's helpful to create a group that is called model. So let's go ahead and do that again for our view. So that would be here and here. Do the same thing. New group from selection. And we'll call this view. And you know, the stacks, and this geo, these are, well, they're sort of unused, but they're like helpers, right? So we will say new group from selection, call it helpers. You could imagine the square image. If you create a struct for that square image for Solargram, you'd want to put that inside helpers, right? These are specific things. And these are helpers that go with views, right? There might be helpers with your network or other things that might be part of the model, but these are definitely helper views. So we'll put that inside the view. And content view is a parent view, but it is still a view, right? So this should also go in, oops, don't want to rename it. This should go inside the view. All right, so we have our view, our model, and then this is the one file I don't put in a folder because this is your app. It doesn't really fit in any one thing of that design pattern. It's just where things start. So I leave this at the top level. Okay, so we have our view and our model. What's missing? Well, of course, we need a view model, right? Because we need to connect this to this using some intermediary. Because right now, there's no way, right? This feed no longer exists. So we will create a new Swift file. And again, I'm just going to do a Swift file. This is not a Swift UI view. It's still a Swift file. So, and okay, so if our model is the manager, the view model is sort of like the curator. And sometimes there's not always a good name for this. So what I would say in this case, we'll call it Pokemon posts. And this sort of depends. Some people, so like I said, the model, I think you really don't want to add that to the name. Sometimes people do like to add view model into this because it helps remind us what it is for each thing. And this is preference. So you could either call it, you know, Pokemon post view model, or you could say like what specifically it is. And so in this case, it's like the public posts or something, right? It's like a subset, or it's taking from the post manager and sharing that. Our app is so simple and there really isn't enough context for us to give a better name like that. So I will actually stick with view model as the name. Typically in more complicated apps, you would not do this. But again, it depends, and there's some personal preference and what's helpful to remind you and all that. All right, so we have our view model. Now it put it inside of here, which is actually not where we want it. So let's take that back out to the parent. And let's go ahead and group that in its own folder that we will call view model. Okay, so our view, view model, and model. This is looking pretty good. Now, with our view model, we do need Swift UI. And again, there's some different thought on this. Sometimes people like their view models agnostic of the UI framework, but the way we're architecting it and kind of the traditional way that it's used, it is, you need it to be part of the UI framework in some capacity. So we will use import Swift UI. Now, what we do want is a class, right? Not a struct this time. And we'll give it the same name as our file name. Pokemon posts view model. And it does need to comply to a protocol. This is important. It must comply to observable object. All right, and now we have our class. Great, we have a view model. What the heck do we do with it? What do we put in here? Well, the most important thing is the view model should be the one and only place that you instantiate your model. So the first thing we want to do is instantiate this guy. And I like to organize my view model. It's eventually a lot of stuff will go in the view model, and so it's good to use these little headers to kind of organize and divide our content. So we're going to say connection to the model. And we'll just call it the model because that's what it is. But of course its type is the Pokemon Posts Manager. And we need to instantiate it. We need to set it equal to something. And that's just itself with the open and closing brackets, which is saying create an instance of this thing. Now I made it a published variable, right? And so that means this whole thing is observable, and variables that are published create like two-way bindings to whoever listens to this thing. And so this will now update, and it will update other things that connect to that. So let's see what I mean by that in practice. So we need a, so the first thing we can do actually is this is set up, and we can simply connect this inside of our view. And so what we would say here is an observed object called view model. And it's going to be Pokemon Post View Model. Now, what's important is I am not instantiating this here. I'm just observing it. I'm creating a binding to it, right? I'm not doing something like this, because that is not the place to do it here. That should be done at the very root view. So we are just observing it. But now that we have a view model, we can fix this problem because it doesn't know about this feed anymore. And so we can say is view model dot posts. And so now, because we have the view model posts, it will work through. Okay, so that's fine, but how do we get this inside? Well, after the content view, and essentially what's going to happen here, if we try to build this, it's not going to work because it needs us to pass a view model. Okay, so it is throwing a fit because this guy uses SwiftUI colors, right? But we only are importing a foundation. Okay, so strictly speaking, and in a larger app, and particularly maybe code that you want to use across platforms, like not just Apple platforms, but maybe you want this code can also be shared on the Android app or on the web server, you typically want the model to not be dependent on your UI framework. You just import foundation. And we would not reference color directly. We might have a string that represents the hex code, right, of the color. For simplicity, and in our apps and demonstration, and sometimes even practically, to be honest, if you don't care about multi-platform, it's just easier to use the colors even in our model. So in this case, we will actually go ahead and import SwiftUI into our model, just so that we get these colors to work, and we don't have to write extra code around manipulating the hex value. But you could imagine, if you wanted to do it, you could keep the hex values here, and it would be the view model where we would translate, the hex values into actual SwiftUI colors. For our sake, we are just going to keep it simple. So let's try building again. Great. So that went away. And so, but now we have a problem because we added this observed object, now in content view, it wants us to pass in the thing, right? Because we haven't instantiated, we need to pass it in some way. So we can say fix, and so we can pass in this view model. And so this might be where I will create the state object, and we'll call it view model, and it's of type Pokemon view model, and this is where we do indeed instantiate it, right? This is where this is where we do type out the whole thing, and we would place it in here. However, if you have a larger app and it's more complicated, right, and you have to pass this thing in every time, it becomes kind of annoying. And you have to write this here, and you have to pass it into each thing, right? So if we wanted the row, if we wanted the view model here, right? Well, now we have the same problem. So, right, we've passed it in here, but then, and our list is here, but now in our row, if we go try to build it, oh, it would help if I didn't put this inside. This should go here, not inside the body. But what you'll notice, and so we can pass it into our list, right? And that's fine, okay. But now, if we want to use our row is unhappy because we need to pass it in here, because now it's expecting view model. And this gets rather cumbersome. So instead of using observed objects and manually passing them in, this is where we would use environment object. This is where an environment object just makes things much more convenient. So instead of observed object, we would call this environment object. It's doing the same thing, but it's getting added to the view in a different way. So now this is an environment object, and also our row is an environment object. Now, when we go here, we don't want it to pass like this. Instead, we go dot environment object, and now we pass the view model like that. And the difference is you pass it in once to the list, and it is indeed available in the list, but also it's available to the children of the list, right? Because this row is created in the context of Pokemon list, so this is part of the same environment, and it's sort of, automatically hidden behind the scenes. It also gets access. So this environment object will work because it's referring to this thing here. And so it gets passed through to all the children. So that's why you'd use it. It's more convenient than passing the observed objects every place. And what we will need to do then is pass the environment object to our previews. So if we go up here, we just copy this, come here, and we'll paste, except it needs to be the whole thing just instantiated in one line, which looks like that. And just because it's, it's the preview, it's shorter, it's quicker that way. I believe since we're not defining it as a state object here, I don't know how that would change interactivity, but it works. I don't know for previews to do it this way, but I know in your actual app, you are supposed to do it this way. Maybe I'll look up the exact differences of what that is. But so you would do it like that, and here, like this is an old error. Oops. object. So like that. Let's try building again. Great, our error goes away. So that's good. So now the build succeeded. So that's what we expect. So at a basic level, we have refactored. And so now we have a content view that refers to the view model, right? And the view model is then how we pass. So now we get our list from the view model. And then our post, our row, it still talks to the post, and it does things, but we also have a view model reference. And okay, so why do we have that? How do we use that? Well, that's the next thing, because right now we do have this as a gateway, but you notice this really isn't doing anything. It's not doing much. I mean, it's just sharing the model. And we kind of said earlier that actually the view should not talk to the model directly. And sure, it's going through our view model, but it's basically talking to the model directly. So how might we create some filters, some gatekeepers to manage that connection? Well, that's what we are going to look at next.